Hey everyone, so in this video we'll look into React testing library. We'll write test cases for a very simple to-do app. So all this app does is take some input in the input field, and on the submit event it adds that entered value into a list and that entered a list on the screen. We'll start with basic test, then we'll move to testing events, and we'll also look a little bit into testing APIs. So without wasting any time, let's get started. So we'll start with a basic test. We'll test if this heading to do app is available in our application or is rendering successfully in our application or not. So for that we have imported a couple of things here. First is our to do component from here, and next we have imported two other things, render and screen function from React testing library. So render function helps us render our component, which is to do in our case, and screen provide us a couple of methods which we can use to access a particular element or elements from our app. So let's write our first test. So we'll write it, which it represents a test case. We can give it any text like renders without crashing. You can provide any text you want. Then in the second argument it will take a function. Now inside this test we'll render our to do component just like this. Now we need to access the text node with the text content as to do app. So for that we'll use like heading equals to, we'll use a function provided by screen called get by text, which will return us the element with the text node, and in our case the text node is to do app. Okay, cool. So now we need to check if this heading is present in our document or not. So for that we'll write expect this heading just to be in the document. Save it. So this to be in the document is a property provided by Jest, which helps us know like this heading is present in our document or not. So we have saved it. Let's run the test with command npm test, and yep, our tests are present. Cool. So we can do the similar thing for this input field as well. So to do the same thing for this input field as well, first we need to grab that input element. So instead of using the same get by text, we'll use another function now. I'll show it in a minute. Let's just write another test case like has an input field. Give it a callback function. So inside here, instead of using this get by text again, we'll use another method which is called get by test ID. So what it does, it will return us the element that have that particular test ID. So in our case we have provided this test ID to do input to our input element. So you can compare it similar to like document.get element by ID in JavaScript, but instead of ID it will give the element with that particular test ID. So what we can do, we can type here like const. Now we'll destructure get by test ID from the render function. Okay, cool. So now what we need to check is expect this get by test ID, then provide the test ID which is to do input in our case. So we'll write to do input, then the same thing that we done above, we'll check that expect it to be in the document. So what we are doing here, we are grabbing the input element and checking if that input element is present in the document or not. So yeah, we are our tests are passing here again also. So next we'll look into how we can test events like on, change and submit. So for testing events we can use the fire event provided by React testing library. So for that we have to type fire event, then the name of the event we want to fire. Then it takes two arguments. First is the element on which the event has to be fired or has to be triggered, and second is the event properties, like what value should be passed to when the event is triggering. So for example, in our to do app, on our input element we have an on change event handler attached. So what that means is, if I go to my input element and type something here like test3, so after I am done typing everything and after the on change event has been successfully triggered, this input element should have a value test3. So we can test it using React testing library. But before doing anything, let's just wrap all of our test and put it in a describe block. So what describe does is basically breaks our test suites into components. So we can type like to do app paste our test cases here. Cool. So now we can write another test case here. For example, like here, when value typed so it will take another callback function. Cool. So we'll do the same thing that we did before. We'll destructure get by test id and get by text both from our render to do. Cool. Okay, so not as we seen in the React testing library documentation, what we have to type is first fire event, then the name of the event change, then it will take the element on which the event has to be triggered. So in our case it is the to do input, so we'll get by test id and to do input. Second argument will be the event properties, like what should be the value, what exactly are we going to type in the input field. So for that we have to write const event equals to target colon value colon, for example test3. Cool. And we'll provide that second argument here. Now what we can check is expect our get by test id to do input. We want to check that it is having this test3 value or not. So what we can use a function called to have value and provide the value test3 that we just provided above. Save. Now let's run the test again using the command npm test, and as you can see tests are passing. Cool. Now the other event that we want to test is the submit event. So after we are done typing everything, and if I press my enter key, this enter text which I typed here should be available on the screen. It should be added to our to-do list. So how we can test it? We can test it using the same thing, using fire event. We have to type fire event, then the name of the event that we want to be triggered, which is in this case is submit. Then we have to provide the name, or sorry, the element on which the event has to be triggered. So in our case it is the form, and it has a test id add on it. So what we can do, we can provide that form using the get by test id function and pass the id add. Now after this submit event has been triggered, that value we have entered in the input field should be added to our to-do list. That means it should be available on our screen in the document. So to test that, what we can do, we can write expect, then we can get that value we have typed earlier by get by text, and then the value was test3. Then we can check that this value or this text node should be available in the document. Now let's just save it. Our test will run again, and all of our tests are passing again. Cool. So cool. The way by which you can test events in React testing library is user events. So it's similar to Fire event. You just need to type user event type, and just need to provide two arguments. First is the element on which the event has to be triggered, and second is the values, what values the event should have. So we can achieve the same thing that we did above for our input field using user event as well. So just write a test case for it. Let's say testing using user event, and pass it a callback function. Cool. So now we'll do the same thing that we did above here. We'll just destructure render and screen by test here. Now what we'll do is we'll use user event dot type, then we'll provide the element on which the event has to be triggered, which is our element with the ID, with the data ID to do input. So we'll get it by get by test ID, and we'll provide the test ID to do input, and we'll provide the value that the event should have. So we'll provide here like test4. Cool. Now once this event is triggered, our input field should have that value in it. So to test that, what we can type is we can type expect get by test ID to do input dot the same function we have used earlier before to have value, and will provide the value that we have just typed earlier, test4. We'll save it. Our test will run again, and all tests are passing now. So in many cases you might see user event instead of fire event, or fire event instead of user event. So both can be used to test events in React testing library, so don't get confused. Next we'll check how we can test APIs using React testing library. APIs are a very important part of any application, and so is testing them. But we should not make an actual API call while testing, mainly because of two reasons. One, it's slow. Two, it's unpredictable. For example, if you are using a weather API, maybe it may return 25 degrees Celsius right now, but tomorrow or day after tomorrow, it may return any other number, 36, 16 degrees Celsius, anything. So for example, in our case, what we are using is an anime chain API. What it does, it will return us a name of any random anime. So we cannot predict what actual name will it return. So what we can do, we can create a mock service. So to create that, we will be using mock service worker npm package. To install it, you can just run npm imsw command. I have already done it, so I'll just continue here. So what we can do, first we have to create a new file, name api.test.tsx, and here we will write our test cases for testing our API. Here we have already imported some couple of things. First is the fetch data function from our api.tsx file, and now we are also importing two things from MSW, REST and setup server. So first thing first, let's just set up a server. So for setting up a server, what we have to do, we have to declare a variable named server, then we'll use the setup server method, and inside it basically we will be listening to the API call, to the calls or requests made to our API. So for that we have to type REST dot get, then the URL of our API. We'll just copy it from here. Okay, paste it, and in the second arguments, it will take a callback function with three things: request, response, and something called context. Now what we have to do, we have to define, like, if the request is successful, what should it return. So we will be returning, if the request is successful, return ctx.json, and inside it we'll pass the anime name as something, for example, Naruto. Cool. It's showing an error for some reason. Maybe it's because of a column. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So now we have successfully set up our server. We also need to add two more lines here. So here, before all and after all just means that we have to run a certain line of code after and before each test runs. So in our case, before and after each test runs, we have to listen and close the server. So now we can simply write our test case to test our API functionality. We can call it and call it successfully fetches anime name, then pass a callback function. Since it will be making an API call, so it will be an async function. Now we can just call our fetch data function here. Fetch data colon. Okay, now we after this request is made, some random anime will should have been returned to us. So if it was a real API call, some random anime would have been returned to us. But in this our case, while testing, our mock service worker will intercept the request and returns Naruto in the response. So this anime variable will have this Naruto anime name in it as a response if the request successfully is made. So to test it, what we can do, we can type expect, and inside it we can write anime dot to equal or to have value, whatever you want. I'll be using to equal Naruto. Control S. Now we'll run our test again using npm test, and all our test is passing. So this was how we can test API calls using mock service worker. So this was all about React testing library for this video. Thank you for watching.